Today we are going to be in Matthew chapter 25. And so if you have your Bibles with you, I'd like to encourage you to go ahead and open those up to Matthew chapter 25. If you don't have a Bible with you, you can grab one from the seat in front of you and use that. You can even keep it if you don't have one. And if you're using it like I am, then we'll be on page 993. So feel free to open up to that. We'll have the words on the screen too, and we'll read it out loud. Just as a reminder as we go into this, our previous passages, as we've read through this, we're in the fifth and final major sermon that Jesus delivers in his life. This is all happening on the Tuesday of the final week of Jesus' life, and he is giving a last substantial teaching to his disciples before he knows that his crucifixion is coming in just a couple of days. And as part of that, Jesus has talked about his second coming. And last week, we saw Jesus was encouraging his disciples to be prepared for his return. Because, as Jesus put it, it's going to come, and when it comes, it's not going to be what they expect. It may not be exactly the time. They're not going to know when it's going to happen, and so it's important that they be ready. And it's important that we know as we go into today's passage that that's our context for what Jesus was talking about. We're talking about his second coming, when he'll come and he'll sort out all of us, those who are faithful to him and those who are not, and divide us out between heaven and hell, and bring us into that final judgment. And I'll say, whether Jesus returns in your lifetime or not is less of a question. The big point that we have to get is at some point we are all going to pass away and we're going to meet him, and we're going to have to give an answer. And really Jesus is giving us some direction for how to be prepared for that. Before we go into our sermon, I just wanted to share a brief illustration with you. Yesterday afternoon I was sitting at the house and watching a history program on TV, and as I was sitting there, my twin daughters had gotten a hold of some of Marlowe's masks. He's got two different masks from Halloween costumes. One's a Batman mask that he wears, and the other one's a Captain America mask. And it's interesting to see because when he puts that mask on and those costumes on, he really believes he is Batman or Captain America. He feels so much more powerful as he does it. And lately the twins have discovered these masks, and my 2-year-old daughters, and they've thought is a whole lot of fun. And so I've got a photo here of them with one of them. In the front you can see Viola with the Batman mask on, and behind is Eleonora with her. And they walked up to me just like this, and it was before I took the photo of them. And Eleonora looked at Viola and said, "Captain America, what are you doing in my house?" And it was pretty cute. And so Viola lifted the mask, and they both acted surprised that it was her, and put the mask back down. And it was funny on multiple fronts because, of course, it's a Batman mask, not a Captain America mask. But so far, basically every superhero is either Batman or Spider-Man. And so it's kind of nice that at least Captain America's in the running now in terms of superheroes they know at 2 years old. Now, I say that to say sometimes we think we're something when we're not, right? And if you didn't figure it out, my daughter Viola is not, in fact, Batman, which the police department has job security. We know she won't be out, knocking out criminals day and night. But it's fun as a kid to think that. And sometimes you think you're something when you're not, and then you come to realize that. And that's a dynamic that we're going to talk about today in our passage as Jesus challenges us in Matthew chapter 25, verses 1 through 30. Now, one of the things I want to point out before we begin is Jesus, in his teaching here, is going to use two different parables. And just as a reminder, a parable is an earthly story that has a much deeper heavenly meaning. And often, Jesus is able to convey a much deeper point by talking about that familiar earthly story, about what's really going on in heaven. So as we discuss this, we'll first discuss the earthly story, try to get that down, and then we'll talk about the heavenly implications for it, and we'll go through both of those. We're going to break our passage into 5 sections today. As always, we'll read each one, we'll stop, we'll discuss it, and I hope God will use that to bring it to life for you. We'll begin today with verses 1 through 5. Before we do, let's take a moment and come before the Lord again in prayer. Heavenly Father, I pray you'd guide our steps. Lord, I pray you'd be at work in our presence in this time, and that you would change our lives as we study your word. We know you didn't call us here in vain, and you have something to say to us. So I pray your word would speak powerfully, and that we would be open to it. Lord, we love you. We thank you for all you do, and we pray this in Christ's name. Amen. All right, verses 1 through 5. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. the bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. Now, I want to point out to begin with, Jesus starts chapter 25 with 3 words, at that time. And I think that's significant. Jesus is trying to point out this is related to a specific thing he's previously talked about. And of course, in context, that specific thing would be his second coming, his return to earth, and his ultimate judgment of humankind. And so Jesus is saying, at that time, it's going to be like this wedding ceremony. Now, for our sake, it's good to know some contextual things about wedding ceremonies in the ancient world, because while today they are super important things, as we've talked about today in our announcements, in that time they certainly were as well, but they were logistically much bigger deals. What was involved was much more of a burden. So just to give you a picture of what a normal wedding ceremony would look like, typically a bride and groom would meet each other. Often they'd meet through friends or family, and there'd be a connection made. Typically in the ancient world, weddings were arranged weddings. So your parents and your spouse's parents or future spouse's parents would decide that you guys would be a good set. And typically they would talk to each person involved in that and make sure they were on board with it. And interestingly, that sort of system of marriage still exists today in countries like India, and it's interesting to know their divorce rates are actually lower than they are in the States. So I think in America it sometimes sounds like a terrible system, but it could be worse. So anyway, you go out and those arrangements are made, but of course, oftentimes you're not marrying somebody who lives right next door to you. So good to imagine that somebody might live in an entirely different state within the nation of Israel, and for the average person in Jesus' day, you didn't have a horse to ride around on unless you were very rich. For the average person, if you were traveling somewhere, even if it was miles and miles away, you'd be doing it on foot or at best on a ship and paying for travel that way. So if somebody lived on the opposite side of the country, it might be attuned to somebody today having to walk from Myrtle Point up to Portland. And I know what you're thinking, why would I want to go to Portland anyway? But supposing you were getting married there and your spouse was there, you'd have to make that trip. And even today, you've got highways, right? So you've got clear path that you can take, and it's paved and it's maintained. But still, could you say exactly how many days it would take you to walk from Myrtle Point to Portland? That'd be quite the trick, right? I mean, what if it started to rain or snow? Or what if there was a big car wreck that blocked the highway? Or, what if somebody tried to rob you on your way there? And in Jesus' day, all these questions were serious questions you had to ask. It wasn't uncommon for roadways to get washed out, for you to be ambushed by highwaymen. There were a lot of variables that could go wrong. And on top of that, beyond all of that, there wasn't artificial lighting. So you had oil lamps was the best you could do if you were traveling. And so most people would not use those with any regularity. Now, in this case, we have to imagine that the groom, along with all of his groomsmen, they are making a trip to the bride's house. And this was traditionally how it happened. And normally how the wedding would flow is the groom and the groomsmen would travel to the bride's house. And several of the bridesmaids would be left out to wait and to guide the groomsmen in. You couldn't just call on your cell phone when you got to town. You had to figure out where these people were. And as I said, you don't know what hour you're even going to arrive. It might be you set out at the beginning of the day, sure that you could make it in 12 hours, and it turns out it was closer to 18. So you might arrive at 2 in the morning. Well, the bridesmaids were supposed to wait out there and have their lamps lit. And that way, whenever you arrived, you'd see, this group of 10 different people with lamps all waiting, and you'd know, okay, those are my people. If I can go find them, then they can lead me to the bride's house. We can find our way there, get the gate unlocked, and we can all go home. And once you did that, they would normally have the wedding ceremony at the bride's house. And afterwards, the groomsmen would escort the bride and bridesmaids all back to the groom's house, and there would be a week-long festival that happened. You were responsible to fund that as the parents of the groom, and so they'd spend a lot of money. All of the beverages, all of the food for a whole week they'd be providing. And it would be a celebration for everybody involved, and also a chance for everybody to see these two people actually got married. They could have been there personally and know it. There was no posting in the newspaper to say, Bob and Nanette just got married, and here's the info. You were normally just going to go there, and that's how you'd know. So in context sake, this is good to know. And I'll also point out, for context sake, that the value of oil in Jesus' day was a lot more expensive than one would think. In Jesus' day, they say the average person lived off of 200 denarius. That's 200 days' wages a year. So if you were a day laborer, there were going to be a lot of times in the year where there weren't crops to be harvested or there weren't ditches to be dug or other things like that. And that's what most people would have worked on. And so hopefully you can collect 200 days worth of wages in the course of your year. That's what the average person earns in the Roman Empire in Jesus' day. Now, to give you some context, if you were to buy 1 gallon of olive oil, that would cost 100 denarius. Half a year's earnings is what. So today in America, just to translate that a little bit, today in America, they say the average American earns right around $60,000. So to make that equate, if you were to buy a gallon of olive oil in the modern time, by that equation, it would cost you $30,000. Would you let your kids leave the oil lamp on late at night? No. You thought your parents were sticklers, I bet, about shut off that light switch. You need to turn that off or waste electricity. You might have heard that growing up. Well, if it were oil lamps, it'd be that much worse. It was very uncommon for people to stay up late at night reading a book or a manuscript with an oil lamp running because oil was quite expensive. But in this instance, these bridesmaids agreed to be a part of this wedding. This is a great social opportunity for them. These are the eligible girls that are all going to be up front. None of them are married. And there's going to be a bunch of eligible guys on the other hand that are not married. And, maybe there'll be some connections made. Maybe their arranged wedding will happen as a result of an activity just like this, a week with these new boys you haven't seen from this town far, far away, or new girls or whatever. So it's an exciting prospect. It's a position of honor. And all 10 of these virgins have agreed to be there and to do this duty. Now we hear, as the day goes along, that 5 of the women are quite wise and 5 of them are quite foolish. The wise ones go out and they take their lamp full of oil. And in those days, it was not a conventional, even like Old West style lamp. It was a bowl with a pinched end on it, and you rolled up a piece of cloth and stuck it in there, and you just lit that off. And that was your oil lamp. The oil wicked up, and it just burned with time. That's how it functioned. We've actually recovered archaeologically many lamps from this time period, and we've tested it, and we know that typically if you fill it with olive oil and get cloth that would have been to that time period, you normally get about 4 or 5 hours of light out of it. Now the trick is, these bridesmaids, they've agreed to this, and they go out, and we imagine maybe they show up at 9 a.m., and they're waiting, because sometime today, the groom's going to show up with all the groomsmen. But we don't know what time, and we can't get a walkie-talkie or a cell phone and ask him. He left, we hope, around this time like he agreed, and he'll be here, we hope, at this time, but it's unknown. And so these maidens wait out there all throughout the day. I'm sure it's a long day. Throughout the day, you don't have to have your lamp on, though, but soon, 7 o'clock or so rolls around, the light starts to fade, and as it does, they need to light up their lamps. And so they all light their lamps, and they're waiting, and we read many of them fall asleep in the process. Their lamps are still sitting there burning, giving some sort of visual indicator to the groomsmen, but time is running out. By this point, we're 4 or 5 hours in, and that oil that was in that lamp that you thought might be enough before is not going to cut it. Let's continue on now with verses 6 through 13 and hear how this parable ends. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom. Come out to meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." "No," they replied. "There may not be enough for both of us and you. Instead, go to those who sell the oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." So the parable continues, and we hear that in the middle of the night, all 10 of the bridesmaids have fallen asleep. And we're not sure if it's somebody who's there guarding them or one of them who stirs awake, but suddenly they look out, and perhaps on a distant hillside, they see coming down the hill a whole bunch of different little oil lamps. This is one of those rare occasions where you're going to travel at night and you're going to burn oil to do it because it's your wedding after all and you want to be there for it. So they see it coming. Somebody shouts out, "They're here, they're coming." And everybody starts to look at their lamps, And pretty soon, the unwise virgins start to realize, uh-oh, my lamp's going to be burned out long before these guys ever get here. And so they ask the others, hey, guys, share your oil with me. Can you give me some? And they respond by saying, well, we could do that, but then none of us will have enough. Our lamps will all burn out before those guys ever get here, and they won't even be able to see where we are. Ultimately, they won't be able to fulfill the very purpose that they had to begin with. And so they're encouraged, go to town, go knock on the door of the oil vendor, and ask them to sell you some. Now, it's good to note, again, there was not like a standard oil of Jesus' day. It was not like a major chain that was selling the oil. Typically, it would have been a mom and pop location locally that processed the oil and that sold it. And as we noted before, it's a very expensive product. So if you have 5 women showing up, needing to buy enough oil to last for a couple hours in their oil lamp, you're probably going to make some good money. Maybe the modern equivalent to $10,000. And so I guess if those people come on your door with $10,000 cash, you probably open it and go ahead and sell your product. They're told to go, they head off, they go do that. But in the meantime, unknown to them, the distance is covered by the groomsmen. They make good time. They meet up with the 10 virgins who were actually prepared, the 10 maidens. And the maidens go ahead and lead them as they're instructed into the house of the bride. They're brought in there to where the wedding feast is going to happen. And as they enter, soon later, we see the unwise maidens coming in. And they look around, figure out pretty quick, oh, they're all gone. They go knock on the door of the house and ask, please let us in. We're here now. But the owner of the house says, I don't know you guys. Effectively, if it were, for example, the groomsmen or the groom, you guys weren't there when I went and picked people up. I don't really know who you are, and I'm not opening the door to you. Now, that might seem harsh, and of course, in the real world, maybe you'd go out and say, well, go ask Beth about me, or, she'll know who I am. Somebody else can vouch for me. But Jesus' illustration is trying to convey this point that all 10 of these women agreed to one thing. They agreed they would be there and that they would be ready, and that they would have those oil lamps ready to burn, if they needed to, with sufficient fuel. But only half of them actually prepared for it, and as a result of that, 5 of them missed out on getting into the feast. Now, when we talk about the implications of this in the real world, it's pretty clear, I hope, what Jesus is getting at. He's saying that these people who have agreed that they're all part of God's family, that they're all part of what God's doing, this wedding ceremony, that's to say they're all Christians, have all made this agreement, and yet half of them didn't bother to take the time to invest today for what they needed to for tomorrow. They neglected that step, and as a result, when the time came that the bridegroom was coming in, which we've seen as a common metaphor for Jesus' return, they weren't prepared. They missed out on it because of their lack of investment now in the things that they should have. They missed out. And probably a big part of it was a lot of money. And even though they agreed to it, they thought, you know what, I'd rather just keep that $2,000 in my pocket. And hopefully this will be enough. Hopefully half as much oil will work. They should have had enough to make it through the whole night, just in case. But they didn't think that far ahead. All right, excuse me. Let's go ahead and dive into the next parable then, verses 14 through 18. All right, verse 14. Again, it'll be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one, he gave 5 bags of gold. To another, 2 bags. To another, 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also, the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. Now, this is the introduction to the next parable. Contextually, again, there's some things that'll help us to know. So, in Jesus' day, travel took a long time. And so, if there was this wealthy man and he was leaving, and he had a lot of cash assets, he's got a question about what to do with it. And many people might have taken it to a bank. It's good to note that actually, for the Jewish people, they were not allowed by Jewish law to loan money on interest to other Jewish people, but they could to the Gentiles. And so there were Jewish people who owned banks that were making a profit that way, and that might be a common way to do it. But in this guy's case, he went to several people he knew who were trusted servants, employees of his, who he believed in. The first one, the one he seemed to trust the most, he gave him 5 bags of gold. Now, each gold coin is worth a couple years' worth of income. And we talk about a bag here. Literally in the Greek, it actually says a talent, which is a unit of weight. But it's enough weight that you'd fill a bag with gold coins. So this could be $10 million that he's got in each of these bags. And the first guy gets 5 of those. And we're told he doesn't miss a beat. He immediately goes and he starts looking for opportunities to invest that. Maybe he buys a property that's undervalued and fixes it up and sells it. Or maybe he goes out and finds a horse or a few horses that somebody's getting rid of that are worth a lot of money and goes ahead and sells those at a profit. Whatever the case might be. Maybe even he goes out and finds different individuals that he knows are going to go do something and invests in their business. This guy is a go-getter, and he goes out, and we're told before things are done, he goes out and takes 5 bags of gold and turns it into 10. He doubles this guy's money, and we're going to estimate probably within a couple-year period. This lengthy trip that's going on, it may have lasted 2 years. That wouldn't have been uncommon at all in Jesus' day. But he doesn't know exactly when the master's coming back. He's just got to be ready whenever that day comes. The second guy, the master gives 2 bags of gold, and it's the same story. He takes the 2, he goes and finds creative ways to invest them, finds safe things to bet on, and goes and takes 2 bags of gold, and in a couple years, he's turned it into 4. He's multiplied it out. But for the third servant, he takes this bag of gold, and he goes and he buries it in a hole in the ground. Now, burying money in the ground was not an uncommon practice in Jesus' day, because banks were a little less stable, and so some people were uneasy about that. And if you wanted to have an emergency fund of money, you wouldn't have a safe or something like that. And the last thing you want to do is invite people over to your house and have piles of gold sitting on it, because they might start thinking, well, I know where I'm going to come if I want a pay raise. I'll come back here later at night and just come take some of that, and this will work out great. So you didn't want to have stuff out that way. But in this case, if the master had wanted to just make a base level of interest on his investment, he would have left it at the bank. Instead, he was asking his servants to do it, thinking, my servants are resourceful enough, they're capable enough, they can go out and make the investment. And for this guy's part, he agreed to that. He could have said, hey, I know you're trying to get me to take this bag of gold, but I have no clue what I'm going to do with that. I don't know how I could make a dime off of it. I'm probably just going to go bury it in the ground if you give it to me. He could have said it up front. That isn't what he said. Instead, he accepted it with the understanding that he was going to take that and investment and multiply it. That he was going to look for opportunities to do that. And as we can see, he did the exact opposite. What he did guaranteed nothing would be gained. And actually, there's some small chance somebody digging a hole in the wrong field would end up with a really happy day. You're like, ooh, look what I found, a bag of gold. All right, let's continue on and see what the master's response to that is, verses 19 through 25. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I've gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I've gathered 2 more. And gained 2 more, His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you were a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. So here's what belongs to you. Okay, so for the first 2 guys, you can see pretty clearly what happens. They come in, it's report card time, I guess. And they come in and they bring in the first guy's case, his 5 bags of gold, and then he grabs another 5 bags of gold and says, you trusted me with this, and I've turned 5 into 10. I went out and I was ambitious, and it was blessed. And the master says, well done, good and faithful servant. You've done a great job, in other words. He was very happy about it. With the second guy, it was the same thing. His 2 bags of gold he brought in, and then 2 more he added to it. I took this, I invested it, it's been multiplied, it's a good thing. And again, the master says, well done, and even says, come and join me, in effect for a party. Come in and we're going to celebrate what you have done, what both of these guys have done. The third servant comes along, though, and he has a different strategy. Rather than acknowledging that he had given his word and agreed to go invest this, and that he never did anything at all, instead he goes and he starts impugning the character of his master. He says to his master, I know the kind of guy you are. You're the kind of guy who, when somebody else's garden's all ready to harvest, you sneak out there and steal food from them. And you're the kind of guy who, if somebody has some land that they haven't tilled and developed, you'll go push your property line over their property line and try to steal that land from them. And so I knew how bad you were, and I thought, I'm not going to mess around with this guy at all. I'll just take his money, I'll bury it in the ground somewhere, and, here it is. You can have it back. Probably not a great strategy. Now, I want to point out for the record, you can see us do this sometimes, I think even inside the church. We come up with all kinds of excuses why we don't need to listen to Jesus. Some people will say, my God's a God of love, and he'd never punish sinners, and he would never send anybody to hell, and so God just wants me to do whatever makes me feel fulfilled, and that'll be good. That sounds innocuous enough, but what you're really saying is that God's not just. That when God looks at murderers and rapists and pedophiles and people who have lied and stolen and all of these sins that are out there, that God looks at it and he's unjust. He just ignores it and says, oh, well, stuff happens. Everybody gets to come into heaven. It's impugning God's character. That's not who he is. On the other hand, we can come at it from many ways, and some people think we can just excuse what we're doing and God will let us off the hook for it. That's not the case at all. So let's continue on, and we'll see Jesus' response to this guy. We'll finish out the passage with verses 26 through 30 and see what the master says in return. Verse 26. His master replied, "You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown, and gather where I have not scattered. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that I would return. When I return, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. Whoever who has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken away from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." I want to point out that last verse to you. You hear oftentimes in the modern church, among more theologically liberal pastors and scholars, they'll say, the New Testament really doesn't ever have anything to say about hell. It's just not a common thing that's there. I want to point out, Jesus breaks from the metaphor at the end of this to talk about the outcome in the real world scenario for the person who does the wrong thing. And he says, we'll cast them outside into the place where they'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's not Arby's, guys. That's, even if your meal was bad, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about hell. Jesus is really clearly talking about hell here as a real world outcome. And so we got to realize the consequences can be pretty steep for this. So we see that the master's heard what the servant said about his character. And I want to point out with this, the master, when his response, he says, so you're saying that I'm the type of guy who goes and steals food from other people, and who goes and plants on other people's lands even when I'm supposed to. And when he says that, this is not him agreeing to it. This is just him questioning the underpinning premise of this. He's saying, you're describing my character as a ruthless guy who goes and takes advantage of other people and is out there just to help himself. And even though you thought that, you didn't even go take that money and invest it in a bank. If you'd done that, at least there would have been interest on it. Instead, you're saying because of that belief, you hid it in the ground. And Jesus' point is, if I'm so ruthless and I'm so evil, why would you want to get on my bad side? Why would you think I'm the guy to cross and take my money and just go bury it in a hole so I have no return? Of course, the opposite's the case. The guy should have actually invested it. He'd agreed to go and do it. And so Jesus, the master's response, which will turn out in the long run to be Jesus, is to tell one of his servants, go grab that guy's bag of gold and give it to the guy who already has 10 bags. And Jesus says something fascinating here, which is a big spiritual principle in God's kingdom. And that is that if God gives you something, if he gives you some sort of asset in your life, and you squander that he may take that away from you and give it to somebody else. The person who's actually diligent with what God gives them, God's going to give more. And I'll say, from an investment standpoint, I think most of us can understand this. If you had asked somebody to invest your money for you, and they did nothing at all with it, it'd be disappointing, especially after 2 years' time. On the other hand, if they at least went and deposited in the bank and got interest, that'd be some base level thing. You could have done it yourself, but at least they went and did that. Or better yet, they multiplied it a few times over, like the other guys did. That would be the thing you'd be excited about. Now, when we get outside of the earthly story here, we start to see that at Jesus' return, many of us who call ourselves Christians will not have made the proper investments today for eternity. We invest in a lot of things in our life. And to be clear, God's entrusted you with a lot. And not everybody has the same amount either. Some of you, by birth or by circumstances in your life or choices you've made, whatever it might be, some of you have more money than other people. Some of you might be smarter than other people. Some of you might be better looking than other people, or more social than other people, or have more friendships, or have more familial relationships, or have more social clout, or have a better degree, whatever circumstance you're in. You might have a better job than other people do. However you got there, today, what you have because God's allowed you to have it. And here, Jesus is warning us that we need to take those things and not just invest them for ourselves now, but we need to actually take them and use them to grow God's kingdom. That prompts the question, how do I do that? And I suggest to you, a lot of the things we were talking about on our connection card today are the kind of things that you can do. Going and volunteering at the church or a Christian charity, giving money to mission organizations or to worthy causes, being involved in your personal life and showing love to people. Jesus summarized the law, as we saw recently, as love others and love God. Do that in a meaningful way today. If you took time once a week and thought of something nice you could do for somebody else, well, that would do something big for God's kingdom. That would be an investment. You'd take what God gave you and you'd use it to expand his kingdom. And here Jesus is pointing out, we don't know when he's coming back. We don't know when we're going to die. We don't know when we're going to have to answer for what we've done. But all of us are investing every day. Some of us are doing it very poorly. Some of us are doing it very wisely. And Jesus is not getting at your 401k here, which, is a good thing. Feel free to invest in that too. What he's talking about is for the sake of eternity, what are you actually investing in? And so I want to ask you guys, what are you investing in your life? Where is it that you are putting in resources now? Time, talent, treasure, whatever it might be. And you're using that for God's kingdom in the long run. We want to be very careful because like those 10 virgins, 5 of them at least, we can think we're squared away. We can think God's at the center of our lives, but not really have it there. And I want to point out with this last parable, the standard wasn't that high. I mean, the master said, if you'd at least invested it in the bank, I might have been happy about it. As a base level, you could do that. You didn't have to be the guy who doubled the money, but if you'd at least done that, done something with what God gave you for his kingdom, then that would have counted for quite a bit more. Now, I want to share with you guys a story, just as a closing thought for applying this to our lives. Years ago, I was told the story of a man from Scotland who was a gifted bagpipe player. And he moved from Scotland and ultimately immigrated to the States in his retirement years, and he ended up settling in Kentucky. So the guy moved to Kentucky, and as he got there in the community, soon he developed a reputation as a very gifted bagpipe player. And in no time, people would call him for community events or for funerals and things like that and ask him, especially for people of Scottish descent, if he'd play his bagpipes. And as time went along, one day, one of the local priests called him up and said, sir, I've got a question to ask you, a favor to ask you. We had a man in town who was extremely impoverished, and he was homeless. He has no family, no friends. But on his deathbed, his one dying wish was that somebody would come and they would play the bagpipes at his funeral. And would you be willing to come out and play at the funeral service? And the guy from Scotland said, absolutely, I'll do that. I understand the circumstances. You don't need to pay me. I'd be happy to. And so he agrees to it. But the priest warns him, well, you need to know, because this guy was so broke, we're burying him in the pauper cemetery, and it's outside of town, and it's like an hour out in the middle of nowhere. So the guy gets directions to it, but somehow he gets it mixed up, and a week later, he's driving out for this 10 a.m. funeral service, and in no time at all, he's completely lost. He has no idea where the cemetery is he's supposed to be at, and he is driving around trying to find it. And finally, a couple hours later, the service is already going to have been done, But he drives up and he pulls up to a field, and there's some men digging a grave in the middle of it, and he thinks, all right, that must be it. So the man gets out of his vehicle, he grabs his bagpipe case, and he walks up, and as he walks up, he sees these workers digging and shoveling, and inside he sees what he believes to be the concrete entombment for the grave. And he looks down, and because he's late, he thinks, I'm just going to go ahead and do what the guy wished. It was his dying wish, and so I'll pull out my bagpipes and play it. So without missing a beat, without talking to anybody, he grabs his bagpipes and he starts playing. And as he's playing, he thinks about this guy's life, to die alone, to die utterly destitute, the sadness of that. And he begins to play out on his bagpipes, Amazing Grace. And those words ring out, and as they do, he throws himself into his instrument more than he ever has before. And the words are starting to ring out. The workers standing around the grave are starting to tear up as they listen to him. And those words ring, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. And as he finishes the song, feeling like he's done it perhaps the best he ever has in his life, he throws his bagpipes back in its case, shuts it up, and walks back to his car and leaves the graveside. And as he's walking away, one of the workers walks up to him, runs up to him, and says, Sir, I have to tell you, that was absolutely amazing. I've never seen anything like it in my whole life. And I have been installing septic tanks for 20 years. So I share that with you to say, sometimes you can think you're doing the right thing, right? You can even have the right motive. You can think you're on the right track. But these details make a big difference. And we all have a calling from Jesus to make sure that we're ready. Whether by death or his return, we need to make sure we're making the investments that we're supposed to today for tomorrow, that our lives are in the right place. And I want to encourage you to do that, because if we all do that, our lives are going to be transformed. If we're faithful with the little things, he'll entrust us with more. And we can not only have our lives transformed, but we can transform this community. We can transform the lives of our loved ones just by being faithful with these little things and seeing a reward for it. Not to mention, we'll actually be in the right place when Jesus comes back, and we have to answer to him. At this point, I'm going to ask Amy and Josh to come forward and to share with us. Josh is going to lead us through communion and offering meditations. Amy will play some special music for us in closing. As they do, I'll ask you to join me for a moment of prayer. Heavenly Father, help our hearts to be in the right place. Lord, it's easy to go through the motions, but it's a different thing to actually be standing with our eyes fixed on you and our lives placing investments today for the eternity that we know is to come. I pray you'd give us a sober view of that. You'd give us the courage to make the changes we need to. Lord, we know that your power is behind us, that your Spirit's here, and that it's what you want to see in our lives, that you'll delight in it. Father, we pray these things in Jesus Christ's name.